I think I have been working in the game industry for about 8 years now, and I started off at VR Play, which is a studio here in Islamabad, and then I moved to Germany to pursue a master's. So was an endless runner, and that was created by VR Play Studios, and it was probably the first or among the first games that had a serious studio backed and a budget to develop a game that was just for Pakistanis. So South Asian target audience. It was launched in 2014 last quarter, and about now it has about 1 million downloads. And we used the Unity engine to develop it. So one of the things that I found interesting is that when I was developing Run Sheeda Run, people would usually come up to me and say, "Why make another endless runner?" So I had this habit that I would just go up to people and then show them a current version of the build because they were all the potential players, and usually I would have positive feedback, probably because they knew me. I didn't really want to criticize the game. But the good thing was that people seemed to like it. They seemed to enjoy it when they were playing it. They didn't really put it down too early, which are all telltale signs that they might actually play the game when it launches. But people gave me free advice that why not make a very unique game design, a puzzle platformer or a puzzle game, something like that. Interestingly, when I would ask them, okay, what do you play? They would say that we play endless runners and casual games and Candy Crush and so on. So a lesson that I learned here is that sometimes players don't really know what they want. You should hear what they're saying, but you should also observe what they're doing. And we didn't really have much data to go on back in 2013, 14. So mostly we had our observations that we worked with. And we made the right decision. I think by now, a lot more people own smartphones in Pakistan, so you would have a better data to go with, which genre you should target, what kind of games would be successful here. Of course, don't take this as a universal rule. Sometimes players absolutely do know what they want. So if your studio makes, let's say, PC games, and you have an IP that is running for years now, which has been for IP, and you launch a sequel that's on mobile, people are right to be annoyed because that's not what they're expecting. We had a clean slate, so this wasn't a problem for us. So let me take you back to 2013 now. At that point, smartphones were still an evolving thing. Every year, the specs would just jump up really heavily, and now Android, since being outsourced, enabled a lot of mobile companies to make phones that were low cost, and people could in Pakistan now afford smartphones even if they couldn't afford iOS. So that was the opportunity, and that was the time when we thought that the market is right, and the market is ripe right now, and then we can target games towards Pakistani audience. Of course, that meant that people had a lot of low-cost, low-end phones. So to deal with that, we went with a game that would be designed for the best phone possible, because we still wanted to make a high-quality game, but then we would optimize it well enough that it would run on low-end devices. Now, to do that, what we did was we would analyze the CPU and the GPU clock speeds and the RAM size, and based on that, we will turn certain features on or off. And there were a lot of environmental props in the game, animated characters around, signboards, and poles, and all such stuff that was just like there for show, that we could turn off and still have a decent experience for the player. And we did this in a pretty basic way. Games like Asphalt by Gameloft do it in a much better way. They have a list of CPUs and GPUs, every single model, and then based on that, they turn features on or off. We didn't have the resources at the time to do that, but just checking clock speeds and RAM sizes worked out well enough for us. So a quick note on the team. So we were 5 people in the core team, and we were pretty new to game development, to be honest. Some of us were fairly experienced in their own fields. Like, for example, our animator had worked in the animation industry, not in the game industry. So we were still new to creating an IP and then taking it to the publishing phase. So that was a bit of an hindrance, but we had mentors with us. We had a great quality assurance team to back us up, and we had a lot of part-time help. So VRPlay at that point had become a decently sized company. We had about, I think, 60 or something employees in-house. A lot of them worked for other clients, and that would mean that if they had time to develop assets, they would just look at our backlog and say, all right, I can help you with this. That, of course, meant that we needed someone to coordinate all of this help. One of the members of the core team would do that, and that meant that when they are coordinating with someone else, they are not spending time working on the projects, and they are lagging behind the stuff that they have decided to work on in a certain timeline. We had producers, but they were also working part-time. So they had their high priority projects, and certain hours of the day, they would spend time with us. So if there was a crisis, there was no immediate help to manage that. And that meant that simple stuff just ate up a lot of time of the core members, who were all developers, and developers in the sense that they were either programmers or asset creators and so on. So the lesson here is take off a few hats. So if you know that you cannot manage stuff on your own, have a producer come in, have a project manager help you. Don't try to take more than what you can. Even if you can do more than you are assigned to do, that can ultimately hurt the project in the long run. So one of the things that might be pretty basic is that since everyone was new to Unity, for example, I, being the lead programmer, would do all of the asset verifications. An asset would come in, I would verify it, give feedback, and this loop went on. And this went so badly that I would be spending the entire day just verifying assets, and in the evening I would start working on my own tasks. So I was crunching in the very beginning, which is a very bad sign for a project. So to fix that, everything was pretty simple. We just install a bunch of free Unity versions on the artists' workstations, and I spent a couple of days to guide them through how Unity works, import settings, how the editor works, and so on. And in the long run, of course, we saved a lot of time with that. Of course, this seems pretty simple, but the reason that I have this in here is that if, for example, you are not working with a mainstream engine, this can become really hard, and I'll touch this up later. Production challenges. So we didn't realize in the beginning, but a team of 5 or more people cannot self-manage. And we were not using a software production methodology. We had nothing like Agile or Scrum. We had no facilitation. We had part-time project managers, which were all weaknesses in our project. And it went so bad that in the middle of the project, we realized that everyone is working really hard, but we are not really getting anywhere. We are not really showing anything that we were supposed to show in the timelines that we had set upon for ourselves, and the team morale went really low. And people actually started to question that whether this project would be finished ever or not. And that's when we put on brakes and we implemented the Scrum methodology. We had some resistance because not all of the team members had work on it. But since I came from a software production background, I knew this well. And we went for 1-week sprints. Fortunately, our mentors had full support to implement this, and just after a couple of weeks, we were right back on track. We were delivering everything that we were supposed to deliver in the time that we were supposed to deliver it in, and all of the problems that would appear or would be communicated after days or weeks were being communicated every day, so everything sped up quite a bit. We had meetings at midday because we have a culture of you can come in whenever you want, spend your 8-9 hours and then leave. So we had meetings at lunch hours where everyone was in the office, and that's when I realized that our most productive hours were when everyone was in the office. So that made the communication much easier. So you were spending less time waiting for another person. I would recommend, this is really up to the company culture, but it's really nice to have like a cutoff point that everyone needs to be inside the office at 11. so that everyone would know that, all right, I have a question from the artist, that guy would come up, guy would start working at so and so time, so I can work on something else at the time. So yeah, this was a bit about the production challenges. I want to move forward and talk a little bit about the art style. I'm not really qualified because I'm a programmer, but yeah, this is something that we noticed. So we wanted to go with a very colorful architecture. So we were targeting the old wall city of Lahore as our go-to architecture. So we wanted to have stuff like this, but we also wanted to have like the old buildings, the dust and the grime, the chipped off paint, and all of the grays and browns color palettes. So we thought that it would be a good idea to go with an art style that resembled either Borderlands or The Walking Dead from Telltale games. That did not work out so well, honestly, because interestingly, well, or maybe obviously, in a fast-paced game, when you are just running and running and running, everything just blurs together. So if you have really grays and browns, they would just blur together and everything would seem even more dirty than you think that they look. So even though we had nailed down an art style that resembled this, we spent a day testing with our quality assurance team who really hated the art style, and we stripped away all of the dirt and the grime and came up with something very flat and monocolored, so everything would be just really simple, and that works great if you're making fast-paced games. So before the release, we preceded it with a small beta, and we communicated that we were doing a beta with our newsletters that would get sent to the interested people every month. And interestingly, 100-something people signed up, less than 1,000. And Google Play provides this platform where you can, right now it's even better, but back then you could do a soft beta release, share the game with people that are interested. Google would create a Google Plus group when that was still a thing, and people could post bugs, and you could communicate them. Feedback from people we didn't know, so they could be brutal about it. And fortunately enough for us, most of it was positive, so that meant that we were in the right direction. We got a lot of bug reports, so a lot of device-specific bug reports that were really convenient. So like I said, the flood of smartphones in the Pakistani market meant that we had a lot of smartphones from those companies that would have really mismatched specifications. So for example, good GPUs, but a really tiny memory. So our algorithm would think that, all right, a good GPU means that it can probably render a bunch of things. So it'll just shove everything into the memory, and then the memory would collapse because it couldn't support everything. So we were able to tweak our algorithm to make sure that we were running a stable FPS on low-end devices as well. So the release went pretty well. We got really positive user reviews, and what was even more interesting is that the ratio between downloads and user reviews was pretty high. That meant that a lot of people were reviewing because they were really happy about the fact that there was finally some game that was targeted towards a Pakistani audience. So that was a really humbling experience. The retention rate was pretty good, both the first and the second week retention rates. And yeah, a rather important question that I got asked a lot during the day today is whether it was a financial success or not. And I think I don't really have the stats right now, but at the point of a launch, we didn't really have any revenue model, a solid revenue model planned. We did have in-app purchases embedded in there, knowing full well that no one in Pakistan would buy anything from the store because at that point, especially, people didn't really have a good enough access to credit cards or any means of online purchase. Ad networks don't really display ads if you're in Pakistan because no one sells ads to the Pakistani market. Even if you're working on an SDK that has ads, that's a problem to sometimes embed because you're not getting ads and you're wondering, is there something wrong with my code or I'm not just getting an ad? So yeah, that didn't work out so well. So we went with an experiment. So we went with in-game ads. So we would display, so we had billboards and signboards everywhere. So we would display logos and stuff inside the game. And the problem with this is that you need a considerable effort, a unique team that just does that, goes to companies, pitches these ideas to people or have them invest in your game. And our core team or even extended team could not do that. Even the market, we had at a point a marketing guy, and even he didn't have time to deal with all of that. So in the end, we had a demo built in where we could put images on the server and that would get downloaded on the player's client and would display on the billboards, but we were never really able to get the Pakistani market on board. To summarize, Southeast Asia is an untapped mobile game market. We have a lot of people that play here. Mostly people play casual and hyper-casual games, but no doubt there are a lot of people that play mobile games in Pakistan. Use development methodologies, do not underestimate that. Don't think that when your team size grows, everything would stay the same. You need someone to aid communication. Get it out there early and often. So we were able to change our art style because our QA team stepped in early enough. Google Play beta helped us out, and yeah, the earlier people see your game, the earlier you get feedback, and those things won't move ahead. Yeah.
कितना टाइम लगा था आपको डेवलप करने में? Like
हम लोगों को 9 महीने. So we took 9 months to develop the whole game.
पूरा beta के बाद.
Yeah, the launch was after 9 months of development, yes. And lastly, monetize your game. Can't stress this enough, monetize your game. How should you monetize in Pakistan? My only answer would be some that would require considerable effort. If you had ideas, I would love to talk to you about it. But yeah, it's something that this is the last puzzle piece that we have to work on. So now, this was basically the postmortem of Run Sheeda Run. I'm going to now touch upon a bunch of stuff that I learned during my career as a game programmer. Most of the lessons come from Flying Sheep Studios, where we make small games, and by small, I mean that our projects run from a month to something like a couple of months, and that's why we have been able to publish more than 150 games since 2014, and most of them really high quality, and all of them within the deadline that have been set for us by the clients. So since I talked about that sometimes it's not really that easy to create a pipeline or bring your artists on board, I just want to show how Flying Sheep develops projects. One problem that we have that mainstream engines can't really give us is that they don't have good support for HTML5 games. So they, for example, Unity has a great support for desktop HTML5, but not so great for mobile HTML5. So we had to make our own engine, in quotation marks, quite early. So how it used to be is that we had Photoshop to create assets, then we would put them in Phaser, which is a 2D game development library that is based on WebGL and uses JavaScript for development, and then we could make a build. So this went for a few early months or years, but we wanted to step into 3D games. So we used this game, very basic racing game for our demo. So we went with a pipeline that was something like this. We would use Blender for our asset creation. We would use Three.js for as a development library, which is also based on WebGL, and then we will make a build. The problem here is that Blender is great for asset production. It is not so great for level design. Blender and Three.js have completely different coordinate systems. So when a level would get imported into Three.js, all of the rotations and positions would be messed up. So we had to remedy this by making our own level editor. So we went with something really bare bones like this that was based on 3GS. So everything would be imported from Blender here. The level designer would put stuff together and then would export it for the project. So now this changed from our previous pipeline to Blender, then Lambda, which is our level editor, and then this will get imported to a 3GS project, and finally would make a build. And the Lambda, which was basically a level editor, just 3D level editor, evolved so heavily in a couple of years that now we use this to do everything. Basically, all of the 3D level designs get made in this, and the UI layouts as well. This also reduced the amount of bugs that you would get when you're using HTML and CSS to make your interfaces. And artists don't need to bicker the programmers that this particular button is 5 pixels on the right and stuff. That just gets handled by the artists themselves in this part of the pipeline. So now I just want, so the reason that I went through this is just to show you a bit of how the HTML platform is so far, because that's not a popular platform by any means. And now I just want to go into a couple of project management lessons, a lot of stuff which basically I'll be quoting my project managers and producers. So we work for hire, which brings in most of our revenue. And working for hire means that you need to understand what the product owner or the client vocabulary is. And they think very differently from us. We work with a TV production studio, so our clients usually think in terms of narratives. So this is a true story that during the development of a game, a client came up to us, and as a feedback, he said that I want another level, but I want there to be a dragon in it, inside a castle. So the protagonist wanders in, fights with the dragon for a couple of minutes, wins, and then goes out into the forest. And now, in late stage of the game, we had to tell the client that we need a dragon, we need a castle, we need to build the AI system, the combat system to make that all work, and then a forest that comes after it. And that's when the client realized that, yes, that won't work in the parameters of the game. So you need to understand how your clients think. And when we work with IPs, we ask for style guides and additional content because knowing that is very important. You need to know what you can and cannot do with an IP. So if you're making a Superman game and you say that, all right, Superman takes the player through a tutorial, maybe Superman cannot say press up to fly because that's something that is beyond what the Superman IP lets you do. So make sure that you understand what you can and cannot do with an IP. Since we do a lot of work for hire, we need to nail down the requirements somewhere. So we work with something that I would call a waterfall-esque methodology. So waterfall is that once you pass a phase, you never revisit it. Once something is done, then it's done. But in game development, you cannot be this rigid. Stuff gets changed, feedback comes in, something isn't fun, so you have to change that. And the bigger projects you have, the more steps you need in this sort of methodology. You cannot treat a month-long project the same way as you would treat a 6-month-long project. And we have fallen into that trap. One of our strengths while working with clients is time estimation. So whatever you estimate is what gets billed, and the better you are at estimating stuff, the better developer you are. It's a very important soft skill. So when we estimate something, our project managers would add a 20% buffer on top so we don't run into any trouble. A few of the things that you should always estimate are meetings. The more unique the game design, the more meetings you would have. If you are copying or are inspired by a certain game and you will copying a lot of things what they did, then you won't need a lot of meeting time. Testing, of course, is very important. Balancing in some games, for example, if your game has a lot of upgrades, then have a considerable amount for balancing. And feedback and iterations need to have a agreed upon time with the clients. If you're making a multiplayer game, double what you estimate and then add a little bit on top, because When you're working with two ends, a server and a client, that means that if you ever have to debug something, you would be doing it on two different ends and just increases the time for everything. And log times for everything. This is really annoying, but this is something that we got used to do, and this really helps the overall company, that we log time for everything. If you spent 1 hour in meetings and then the next hour working on the gameplay character, log time for that. So after the project, the project managers can show you that this is the amount of time that you estimated, this is the amount of time that you actually worked on it. And that would improve your estimation skills, that would improve the time that the studio codes to the client. This is an example of our estimation sheet, which also evolved over time. So we have the task which would be delivered in whatever version of the game, whether it's an MVP feature or it's an extra, the task description and the time allocated for it. Every single team member does this. One of the things that we got really good at is being able to reuse either whole projects or modules from the project, since we were making a lot of games in very small amount of time. So this is an example of two games that are basically clones of each other. So the first one is from the IP Hotel Transylvania, and the second one is from the IP Barbie. And we were able to make very little game design changes, and we're able to make the client happy because they have to pay less, and the developers happy because they have to work less. And this is great if your projects are small, but this does not work out very well the bigger your projects get. So again, these are two different IPs and are sort of the same game. Both are role-playing games. The first one is from Troll Hunters, the second one is from Lego's Ninjago. And when the client realized that shortcut, that, oh, make a reskin of that game, we had already made the Troll Hunters game, and he said that since I would use the magic word reskin, they would get a really good deal. But the thing is that since this game is considerably big, we had to change the AI completely, the NPCs AI completely, the character combat completely, and this took about the same time as the first game, even though there were less team members working on it. So yeah, 9 women cannot make a baby in a month, is what you might have heard. So this is something that the client would expect, but yeah, you can't always do that. Another thing that we consider very important is naming conventions, since we are talking about reskins. So we make sure that since the developer and the artist have a very different idea about what naming conventions should be, we have a document that specifies this. Also, we use very generic names. So the player called Jim would be called player, and all of the code and the assets. So when we reskin something, we don't get bogged down with these kind of details. And since we work with JavaScript as our programming language, we have to agree on a standard. We have a linting tool called ESLint that has really improved our development time by cutting down on bugs. Also makes the code more reusable or readable, because all of the developers are sort of working in the same parameters. Quick note on tracking, we use the Google ecosystem for everything collaborative, so spreadsheets, Google Docs for all of the design related stuff. And when we started with tracking tools, we started with Basecamp. It's not great for project tracking, so we went with something that resembled Trello, and finally we settled down with Jira. Jira sometimes puts people off because it takes some time to set up, and then you can get up and running. But to be honest, once you do that, I don't think that any other tracking tool can really match exactly what you need. And in our case, we even though had a bit of an iterations with it first, and now I can't really think of using anything else. It's really well suited for our needs. Revisiting a point that I made earlier, 4 is a crowd, now I named it. So 3 people, interestingly, can manage, self-manage pretty well. So 3 is a magic number. As soon as you add a 4th person to the group, something happens, and you need someone to facilitate your project. And the bigger the team gets, the more important it is to have a software project methodology implemented. Yeah, so when four or more people are in your team, then consider agile methodology. Quick note on documentation. So we have the regular employee onboarding that every company has, but on top of that, we also have our tools and processes onboarding, because since we are using a custom engine, we need to have that in there so people can come up to speed easily, and we then every time a new hire comes in, we ask for feedback and then improve these documents. Thing that we do is whenever we embed an SDK, any SDK at all, if it's Flurry, we document it, how that particular SDK was implemented in our project. So when the next developer does that, he or she doesn't need to read up on all of the online documentation. They can just look at how it was done in a previous project and just learn from there. So it reduces the development or the integration time considerably. Quality insurance is very important in terms of game development, because this is quality assurance, balancing, and user experience are three values that you are giving to your clients, and that's what separates you from a normal software company and a game studio. So if a client goes to a game studio, they would probably quote them much less, because and you as game developers would code them much more, because you have a user experience engineer and you have artists and you have quality assurance team, which they might not have. So these are the values that you need to then give to your client. You have to justify the cost. So one of the things that we used to do pretty frequently is sanity check. So make sure that all of the UI layouts are as the UI artist intended them to be. Balancing, like I said, if you're making, let's say, a tower defense game, then balancing is extremely important. And for us, we use a black box testing method, and we use a combination of devices, operating systems, and browsers, so that we make sure that it just runs the same way on every single device. There are no browser-specific bugs. And I'm really glad that Internet Explorer got phased out, honestly. So now moving on, I'll share a few developer lessons that I've learned so far. So the first one being that as a developer, you need to learn how to communicate with other people in your team, the artists, the quality assurance people, everyone. So you understand the pipeline well enough, understand the tools well enough. So for example, I really benefited by understanding Blender. I had to use it in academics, and now whenever I have to talk to a 3D artist, I can tell them that, yeah, this face has flip normals or something. So they would understand completely what I'm saying. Or if I say that I want to additive blend two planes, I know that the person working with Photoshop would have that as multiplicative blending in Photoshop. And I need to understand these terms so we can get on the same page easier. And communicate in a non-programmer vernacular. And I cannot stress this enough, that often when programmers get together, they talk in terms like, this will happen in real time, or the default setting is that, and sometimes other people can't understand what you're saying. It's especially true if you're writing messages, error messages, for example, which would never be altered. So make sure that you understand your people that are going to play your game. Use open source libraries as much as possible, use asset packs as much as possible. I think one of the previous talks also mentioned this. And you save a lot of time, and the only downside is that in case you're using open source libraries, sometimes only one person with a couple of collaborators has made that, so that might not be updated as soon as you want it to be updated, and you might have to replace it with another library at some point, or have to wait for them. But still, at a given point, don't try to early optimize too much, and at the given time, whatever you have, work with it. Even our complete engine is made out of open source libraries, so that should give you an idea of what are they capable of. And of course, we ran into trouble, for example, with, like I said in the pipeline phase of the presentation, that we ran into trouble of the Blender exports, because back then Blender didn't really have a unified export format. Right now, like you have FBX or OBJ, which are pretty standard. Now you have GLTF. Back then, it didn't exist, or 3GS didn't really have support for it, so we ran troubles there. Quick note on user experience. Even if you're not the user experience engineer in your studio, as a programmer, you need to understand this well enough. In our case, so I'm going to talk about a bit about controls first. So for our case, since we're making cross-platform games, same game might be played on a mobile device, the same might be played on a desktop. So we have to make sure that they have like a standard that we follow. So what I'm trying to say is that some controls are just easier on touch screens and some are easier on mobile and keyboard. And that becomes an actual problem when you are working with mobile, multiplayer competitive games. If a person has an edge on mobile versus mouse and keyboard, what would you do about it? Sometimes we have to handicap them a little bit to have them on the level playing field. This can be, of course, eliminated if you just match mobile players to mobile players and PC players to PC players, but sometimes you don't have the luxury because you don't have enough players in your game. Know your audience. So an interesting example is that millennials grew up with pushing stuff. So we push mechanical buttons, we push digital buttons, and that's how we would interact with every new interface. But in the case of Generation Z, who are growing up increasingly with mobile devices, they're really comfortable flicking and swiping things. And we didn't realize this until our client did an actual play test. And that's when we realized that, all right, they don't perceive interfaces the same way that we do. So yeah, that's a nice thing to have if you can read literature upon it or if you can conduct play tests with players. One of the things that we call the Homer test, based on Homer Simpson, is that we make sure that our adult stubby fingers aren't blocking information that you are seeing on the interface at any given time, especially if your game requires you to put a thumb on the screen at all times. It's basically feedback, but in a very nice way. So this is an example of juiciness where you just tap on a monster and it explodes, screen shakes, and particle effects go everywhere. You see the score rising up on top. All of these things, this is the difference between Candy Crush and a match 3 game that you make in a 48-hour game jam. It's the juiciness, and this really increases the dopamine that your brain would generate when you play such a game, even though functionally it might be very similar to another game. Another example about the same concept, this is from our game Sunrise Roots, where you can tap on stuff and those things would get harvested, similar to Farmville. But here you can see that when you tap on a tomato, it blows up, particles go everywhere, it goes into your HUD, and that is a difference between doing this versus just tapping and your HUD is saying that, yeah, you collected a tomato. This really adds value to your game. And the last section of the presentation, prototyping. This meme isn't funny, but it's very true. So I'll talk about two categories of prototyping, high fidelity and low fidelity. Low fidelity means that you deal with just papers and throw away prototypes, and high fidelity means that you actually make sort of a software prototype. So for example, in the case of Run Sheeda Run, even though we knew that we were just copying the game design of games like Temple Run or Subway Surfer and so on, we still wanted to nail down the swipe up, down, left, right, these controls, so the core loop feels really fine before we could progress further. I'll start with low fidelity prototype first. So to give you an example, this is a screenshot of the level design of our game Sunrise Roots, where your character can move around the map, can go to other NPCs and ask for quests, give them stuff, and basically just roam around and do stuff. And before we had this map, we had to make sure that this was actually fun, the roaming around and going from one place to other. So we had something like this first, and then our level designer changed that map into something like this using Photoshop, and then we made a board game out of it to make sure that it was fun. So the player is on the left, and if you just exclude me, the two people on the right are the game masters. And the player basically plays the game, and the game master simulate the game for her. If she sells something, she gets currency based on those red and green chips. If she gets a resource, the game master would write tomato on a piece of paper and give it to her, and this would go on until they're satisfied that her movements with a player piece on the board and going from one place to the other or simulating the cycles of the game are actually fun. If they are fun, then you can go ahead and be sure that your digital prototype or digital version of the game would also be fun. And then based on that feedback, this is what we eventually had as our final level design of our city. Sometimes you can't conceptualize a game idea very well using low fidelity. That's when you need high fidelity prototypes. So for example, Sunrise Roots also has this feature where you collect furniture and you place it around, and this is just a high fidelity prototype just to make sure that this interaction is intuitive and fun. So to summarize the second part, adapt development methodologies to project prototype. 4 is a crowd. If you have too many people, think of having a producer or and actually not or a development methodology. A time estimation is a very important soft skill for both the studio and the game developers. Documentation saves everyone's time, even though it's a bit of a pain and sometimes slows you down in the beginning. In the long run, it saves time. Understanding the production pipeline and tools is very important for easier communication. Use third-party libraries as much as you can. User experience and juiciness is a very important value that you give to your clients. And prototype early and often to weed out bad ideas. So if you make a bad decision, you're not stuck with it for the rest of the project. So I hope this gave you a bit of an insight or about the Pakistani market, and all of my lessons learned were, well, at least some of them were interesting to you because as I understand, a lot of the people here are experienced developers. Yeah, I also like to thank the organizers that they provided this platform. I think this conference is a really great step to have. Like, I think Pakistan lacks from this feature of knowledge sharing and social interactions between the game industry, which is very important to help us grow. So thank you. And yeah, I would hang around if someone wants to talk to me about any of these stuff. I'd love to talk about it. Yeah, if I have time. Thank you.
ज़बरदस्त मेरे क्वेश्चन थोड़े से आपने टेक्निकल टर्म्स कुछ यूज़ किए तो उसके बारे में फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आपने एक एसेट वेरिफिकेशन टर्म यूज़ किया तो वुड यू प्लीज़ एलाबोरेट कि एसेट वेरिफिकेशन से आपका क्या मतलब है
I actually said that we use non-programmer vernacular, and I fell into the same trap. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. So by asset verification, I meant that whether a particular asset would work as the animator or the artist intended it in the engine. So if you made something that looks great in Maya, for example, and then you import the same animation into Unity and realize that the camera angle that you have set up in the game doesn't really work well with that particular animation. So, or for example, if you're built an asset and maybe it does not support dynamic batching in Unity, so you have to make sure that it works in the engine as you model it in your modeling tool.
Great. अच्छा एक और टर्म यूज़ हुई है IP, I guess intellectual property.
Intellectual property, yes.
Would you please elaborate?
Yeah, so intellectual property means anything that is related to, so for example, Run Sheeda Run is an IP because it has a game, it basically is a brand. It has a game, it has its own comics. Marvel has many IPs, Captain America, Iron Man, all of these are IPs. Hotel Transylvania, which I gave an example of for DreamWorks Trollhunters, these are all IPs that are owned by a particular company. So that's what I meant when I said IP.
Game के अंदर जो particular design है, that is IP.
The designs in the game are supposed to reflect the IP. So for example, like I said, if you're making a game from the Superman IP, you have to make sure that the character model is exactly like Superman is supposed to look, that Superman says exactly the same voice lines that he would normally says in the comics or the movies or any other media. So you have to make sure that that IP follows what the creators of that IP intended.
Okay, final question. आपके thoughts क्या हैं references के बारे में और reskinning के बारे में?
Sorry.
रीस्किनिंग आपने एक टर्म यूज़ की रीस्किनिंग विच इज़ क्या जैसे आपने लेट्स से रन शीदा रन के लिए भी आपने टेंपल रन हम कह सकते हैं कि रिजेम्बलेंस है एक आइडिया में सो ये और रेफरेंसेस और रीस्किनिंग के ऊपर आपके पास थॉट्स चाहिए थे कि व्हाट डू यू थिंक अबाउट दैट
Yeah, that's a very broad question. Yeah, I think there is a point where, so yeah, I think probably the reason you're asking me this is that there was a point where Pakistani market had like a lot of these like churning clones and just running with them. Yeah, so I understand where you're coming from. So there is a point where your game, like there's a line where your game is a clone versus when your game is just following a genre of a game. So for example, Run Sheeda Run is an example of that. People did accuse it of being a clone, but to be honest, yeah, it follows the genre. It's not some generic character that's just running around a generic street. It had some thought put in that, all right, we will copy the walled city of Lahore as our architecture and environment, and this Sheeda kid has the chicken who needs to be saved from the butcher, and that was the whole idea behind it. Also, for example, one of the things that we did a bit uniquely is that you can also change lanes and turn, which wasn't really a thing back then. Either you had turns in Temple Run or, yeah, I mean, even if we had made a complete control stream of one of these games, we had enough thought put in that made it a unique game. But yeah, again, there is a fine line and you know when you're crossing it, honestly.
आपने बताया था कि हम रैम साइज और सीपीयू स्पीड देखते हैं उसके बाद फिर हम चीज़ें ऑन ऑफ कर क्या बता सकते हैं कि वो हम किस तरह करते हैं
So the great thing about Unity or well working on native platforms is that you can get all of the hardware information. So Unity lets you get the CPU model and the clock speed and every single thing there is to know about a CPU, same for GPU, same for the memory size. So based on that, our algorithm would just see that, all right, if the, let's say, random values that the clock speed of the GPU is more than 200 megahertz, that means that it can render this character on screen. Then based on that information, we would render that character on screen. If it's less than 200 megahertz, we won't. So that's what we went with. Did I understand your question or? All right, yeah, we can talk about it if I missed something. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thank you.